September 26th, 2014. That date was the release day of Khans of Tarkir, one of Magic's most monumental sets. This set is responsible not only for being the first reprint of the Onslaught fetch lands, but it also was the first time that the color wedges had ever been given a name. Also, for me personally, it's the set that marked my first ever pre-release. Welcome to ComedIan MTG. Today, I am participating in the Mindsculptors iconic Decklist challenge. The idea behind this challenge is to port a famous deck, from 60 card Magic over to competitive EDH. And the deck I chose is Jeskai Ascendancy Storm. Now, for those unfamiliar with Jeskai Ascendancy Storm, the point of the deck is to land a Jeskai Ascendancy onto the battlefield, and therefore start to storm off. The idea is that if you have creatures that either produce mana or untap your lands with the ability to either filter from your deck from Jeskai Ascendancy or using cards like cantrips to continue to draw more and more gas off of your deck. Eventually, you will have drawn enough cards and gained enough advantage either through adding more and more mana-creating creatures or by increasing the size of your creatures due to the other part of Jeskai Ascendancy's abilities. In the 60 card variant of the list, a lot of the time, the creatures will just get arbitrarily large enough that they will be able to punch through at the opponents and deal upwards of 20 damage. Now, there have been many different variants of the Jeskai Ascendancy Storm list. It was played in Standard at the time, it was played in Modern, it has been played in Pioneer. The Modern variants have evolved and evolved over time where they're almost unrecognizable compared to the original variant. Nowadays, there are variants that involve using Emry to recur Lotus Petals out of your graveyard, or using Underworld Breach to be able to do the same thing. In fact, the original Jeskai Ascendancy Modern combo deck was so powerful that it was cited as the reason that Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise got banned from Modern. So, given the raw power of this card, and the fact that Jeskai Ascendancy was one of the first cards that really got me interested in combo decks in Magic, I knew I had to build around it for this iconic decklist challenge. Now, let's start with the commander for this deck. Most of the Ascendancy lists in Modern are actually running one legendary creature as their companion, and that is Jegantha the Wellspring. Now, I did think for a time about running Jegantha as a companion for this deck with a more card advantage based 5-color commander at the helm. But after some testing, and given the fact that I couldn't play cards with 2 pips like Force of Will or Ad Nauseam, I ended up deciding to make Jegantha my commander instead. Now, one thing that's very important to note that I did not realize when I was first playing this deck and first building this deck is that Jegantha's mana ability has a very important qualification on it. It says add white, blue, black, red, green. Period. This mana can't be spent to pay generic mana costs. Now, that is a very important qualifier while you are storming. You have to realize that there is a lot of potential there to really mess up these storm turns if you are relying on Jegantha's mana too strongly. So noting that that mana can only be used for colored pips and not generic costs is extremely important, and also requires you to keep your Jegantha mana for the storm turns a little separate, which can add a bit of complication. Now, just a reminder before we go to the deck to hit like and subscribe while you're here on YouTube to help support the channel, and if you're feeling generous, check out our Patreon. Our deck for today is one I call Ascend the Wellspring. Now, the point of this deck is to fully utilize Jeskai Ascendancy to the full of its potential. With Jegantha in the command zone, we are actually able to tap and float Wooburg, one of each color mana, and then anytime we cast a spell, we get to untap Jegantha and float that mana again. What ends up happening is, with Jeskai Ascendancy on the battlefield, as long as we have a way to continue our card advantage, we end up generating near infinite mana in a manual way. Now, when building this deck, I figured one Storm enchantment just isn't enough, so I'm actually playing 4 in this deck list. I'm playing Underworld Breach, Jeskai Ascendancy, Song of Creation, and Whirlwind of Thought. The best part about having Jegantha in the command zone is that Jegantha can basically cast most of these just by activating once. Therefore, the high costs that normally come with these enchantments is really minimized with Jegantha on the battlefield. But the point of this deck is to genuinely be a tried and true Storm deck that really breaks these enchantments that really go over the top of what other decks are doing. Now, you can't really play Storm in our format without dipping into Ad Nauseam, so it felt like pretty much an auto include in here. Now, when looking at the creature packages of this deck, you'll notice something about all of the mana dorks. They all can tap for the color blue. Now, this is a very intentional choice. This deck definitely requires that, like having Jegantha in the battlefield, when you have Jeskai Ascendancy out, you want your spells to be able to continue fueling that storm. So when you're playing spells like Opt, like Brainstorm, you want to be able to untap and basically cast those spells for free with Jeskai Ascendancy on the battlefield. So that's why for a Storm deck, you're going to see a lot more mana dorks than on average. Destiny Spinner fits perfectly in this deck as it makes all of our 4 very potent enchantments completely uncounterable. And when those spells are on the stack, they become very high priority targets. So making it so that they cannot be interacted with is super key. The last 2 creatures of note here are Hullbreacher and Dockside Extortionist, which in any Storm deck or any deck trying to leverage wheels, go fast, you want both of these cards. I am playing most of the wheel effects available in these colors. We're on Windfall, Wheel of Misfortune, Wheel of Fortune, and Time Twister. So Hullbreacher makes an auto include here. And with any fast deck, playing Dockside is extremely necessary and basically should be played in any deck playing red. Going into the sorceries of this deck, there is nothing really special of note. It just contains your classic Storm options, many wheels, Yawgmoth's Will, some rituals, all pretty standard. Now, this deck definitely has a lot of requirements as far as cards needed to be in the deck, so you may see things like Cabal Ritual not present in the deck. However, black mana pips are actually not that frequent in the deck. I believe they are, only 8% of our actual amount of mana produced. So playing a card like Cabal Ritual probably wouldn't be as great. And for that very same reason, this is a Storm deck without Dark Ritual. The amount of mana production of that card is very powerful, but if it can't be utilized in our Storm plan, then it doesn't really make sense to be included here. Moving on to the instance, one treasure found from the modern version of the deck is Cerulean Wisps. Not only does it cantrip and basically trigger our Jeskai Ascendancy or whatever Storm card we are using at the time, but it also untaps a target creature and makes it blue until the end of turn. That part actually can have some small upside, seeing that we do play Bloom Tender and Fabro Elder in the deck, so making Jegantha a teamer card can actually be a small benefit. However, Cerulean Wisps is just fantastic. A lot of the times with Jeskai Ascendancy on the battlefield and Jegantha, you can untap Jegantha to the Ascendancy trigger, float Wooburg mana, and then have Cerulean Wisp resolve, untapping Jegantha once more, floating another now 10 colored mana, and you get to draw a card, which is absolutely fantastic. As far as the artifact suites, nothing too crazy, a lot of sort of classic cEDH staples and Storm options. Chromatic Star and Chromatic Sphere do not see as much play, obviously, in the current metagame, but when it comes to the fact that the deck tends to just want to have non-creatures that are extremely easy to cast. For example, there are many times when you'll draw into something like a Mana Vault, which is awesome because it gives you a bunch of mana on your Storm turns, but then sometimes you don't have things to dump it into. So Chromatic Star and Chromatic Sphere are really awesome in ways that they can channel the mana into something more productive for our Storm turns. Also, classic Storm win condition, we are actually playing Aetherflux Reservoir as our main way to win the game. We do have Breach Lines as mentioned before, but Reservoir is definitely our I win button. It's a lot easier to assemble than a lot of the other Storm cards, and it pretty easily can be cast with our mana rocks in this deck, so it felt like a pretty necessary include. Going back to the instance for a second, Repeal is a card I have seen Nadix play a lot in his Storm list, and I think it's rather underrated. It is really great for especially these type of Storm decks where you can have something like a Mox Opal in play. You can tap that Mox Opal for blue, cast Repeal for X equals 0, and then be able to draw a card and basically just get a free Storm count and card draw. Over to the enchantments, we have our classics of Carpet, Mystic, and Rhystic, and then the rest, as we mentioned before, are our win conditions in Breach, Ascendancy, Song Creation, Whirlwind of Thought. So that's the main deck and the main game plan. We are just trying to manually storm as quickly as possible and leverage a win through the amount of raw mana advantage that Jegantha provides and the raw card advantage provided in our 4 staple enchantments. Now, as you can see, I am over on Moxfield, the site which I host all of my decks. I will be leaving the link of this deck down in the description below. One thing I will say about this deck is it is fantastic to play and it is super fun, and I really highly recommend at least giving it a play test because storming off with this deck is absolutely wild. But I figured I'd do a few playtest hands for everybody just so they figure out how the deck sort of operates. Now, this hand is actually really solid. It provides a lot of the things that we are looking for when it comes to this deck. Now, to be clear, this hand is really only solid if we are not on the play. If we are on the play, it is considerably worse, but having that turn 1 Grim Monolith is pretty imperative for the progression of this hand. However, there is definitely a play you can do turn 1. It's going to cost you 5 life, which is definitely tough, and that's Vampiric Tutoring for a mana crypt to get down your Jegantha on the 2nd turn of the game. But once again, that is definitely a life-intensive move. So if we are on the draw here, we definitely want to cast down this Gemstone Caverns, and we have a bunch of different lands. Taiga's probably one of the worst ones, so we'll throw that into exile. Then I would draw for my turn, would play a Steam Vents, and get down this Grim Monolith. This is a turn 1 Grim Monolith leading to a turn 2 Jegantha, and that's exactly where we want to be. Let's try a different hand. Now, this hand is ironically extremely similar to the last one. We can power out a turn 1 Grim Monolith, we have a Demonic Tutor to go get us one of our card advantage engines, and that's about it. This hand is absolutely fantastic and one that I'm very excited to keep. This is our first very questionable hand. It has 3 of our powerful enchantments in it, but no way to really break any of them. And we really don't do anything on the first couple of turns. Now, if this hand had even as small as a single cantrip, I would very much enjoy it, but it does not. So we'll go to a 2nd 7. In certain decks like Tavesh, Krom, and other archetypes like that where you have very powerful 5-mana commanders, you definitely could like play a City of Brass, Rite of Flame, Lion's Eye Diamond, and play your commander. However, Jegantha has absolutely no card advantage to her, and therefore that line of play doesn't really work. That seems to be about the only potent thing you can do in this hand, so I'm very inclined to mulligan it. Okay, this is our 6. Boy, is it slow. It's slow and it doesn't have any card advantage. You would just play Chromatic Star turn 1, then a turn 2 Bloom Tender, and it's just, that hand doesn't really do anything. There's no way to find our enchantments, so we'll go to 5. So this hand is very interesting. It basically says to me, and this is a 5, remember, so we can't be that picky. So I'm definitely going to put this Brain Freeze at the bottom, because until you're storming off, that card is extremely dead. And then I have 2 choices here. I don't want to get rid of either of my tutors, despite the fact that they cancel out draws. They're very powerful effects. I'm considering dumping the Force of Will, and that is because when you're at such a low card advantage state, like my game plan entirely with this hand is to play this Rhystic Study, meaning that I don't even have another spell for Force of Will in this hand. So I think I have to bottom it. So now my game plan is to draw my card for turn, to play a City of Brass. I will then Enlighten Tutor for a mana crypt, making it so that turn 2 I can play my Rhystic Study. If that goes very wrong, I can Savines it back to the battlefield the next turn. So despite it being a tough mulligan, it's definitely one that has play to it and one that I'm going to keep. This is a new fresh hand, and I like this one a lot as well. So this hand basically plays out in the way that you get to turn 1 play a land and a Mox Diamond. After that, you can use that mana to play a Fellwire Stone, and maybe if you're even lucky enough, be able to Mystical Tutor for something you're looking for. Now, I don't know if I want to fire off this Mystical Tutor when I don't really have a target for it, but it's something to know that you can do if the need arises. Then that next turn, you have access to, at minimum, 3 mana. So let's play that out. So you draw Tundra, Mox Diamond, pitch the Flooded Strand, and then you play out this Fellwire Stone and the Lion's Eye Diamond. Next turn, Draw a land for turn, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4 mana. Now, if you would tutor for something with Mystical Tutor here, that's fine. I just don't know what you would grab. I think I'm like pretty inclined to just Windfall here, depending on what my opponents are doing. So if my opponents have all had very aggressive hands where they have dumped their hand out, I'm definitely not going to just refill their hands with only a single mana up. But in most circumstances, me rebuilding here because I am a Storm deck is very good for me. And also being able to Windfall and crack the LED so you actually have access to 4 mana is pretty great. That obviously comes with the risk that your Windfall gets countered and then you are sitting there with no hand and mana that floats away and does nothing. So I feel like at one point Storm decks would keep something like this when the meta was a lot slower because you have some cantrips. You have a lot of cantrips actually with Repeal, Sleight of Hand, and Ponder. But these two are dead cards and they don't give you any advantage and they don't give you any ramp, so I would be heavily inclined to ship this. This hand is also overwhelmingly slow. You have obviously 2 very powerful cards here in Demonic Tutor and Yawgmoth's Will. You have a talisman that you can drop the second turn but does nothing. Now this hand is definitely interesting. This is our 6. And once again on a 6, I think we're gonna ship a Force of Will here. You can definitely keep this hand. You only have access to Grixis mana, which is fine because you have Yawgmoth's Will and Repeal, although I don't think you're casting Yawgmoth's Will anytime soon. And definitely there is an argument for throwing that away instead of the Force of Will, but I would much rather have the Will, especially on a mulligan. The Hierarch is also uncastable, so that's definitely something you can also argue to throw away, but as we mentioned with Ascendancy, it's kind of an important card. One last hand and then we'll start wrapping things up. Now this hand is obviously very explosive. You can get down Jegantha on the second turn of the game and even have mana up, which is awesome, but then you don't do anything. There's nothing in this hand that provides any sort of card advantage. Yawgmoth's Will doesn't do anything at this early point in the game, so I think you actually have to mulligan this hand. Now this hand is a little more complicated. My instincts for this hand specifically are to play the Misty Rainforest, go grab an Underground Sea, and cast the Vampiric Tutor at the end of turn. With that Vampiric Tutor, I would be very inclined to go grab a Jeweled Lotus, so that on the second turn we can play our Plateau for turn, play Jegantha, and then going into our third turn, I can get down a Whirlwind of Thought and being able to start storming off, which is nice because we have the Yawgmoth's Will and we will have a fetch land in our graveyard. So anything else we draw from this point on, whether it be interactions, cantrips, or more non-creature spells that will trigger our Whirlwind of Thought, they will all assist us in going towards our game plan with this hand. So despite the hand looking actually a little lame, the power of Jeweled Lotus being available is pretty awesome. And that concludes our deck tech for Jeskai Ascendancy in cEDH. I really hope you guys enjoyed this deck. I'd love to see your comments down below on how you think the deck will play. It is super fun to operate, and if anyone gets a chance to try it, I'd love for them to comment down below. Now, if you're looking for more of these iconic Decklist challenge decks, there is a playlist featuring every video that has been made with them so far. There's going to be groups on there like Play to Win, the Mindsculptors themselves, and even Playing with Power at some point. So keep looking out for those. It's been really awesome to be able to collaborate with this group, and there are gameplay videos with these decks coming out pretty soon on the Mindsculptors, so definitely keep a lookout for those. All right, everybody, thank you for joining me for this awesome deck tech, and have an amazing week. Peace.